Today is probably my favorite lesson in this whole unit. Today we are talking about protest music. Oh, I love protest music. It is a musical genre directed at social injustices and a desire for change. Now, just a quick side note, if you like this class, next year I teach a whole semester long class about protest music. The first quarter is stuff like this, except we dive into each movement a lot more in depth. And then the second quarter of it is looking at protest musicals and how music tells a story. All right. So, again, protest music is a musical genre directed at social injustices and the desire for change. We're going to look at three of the biggest movements today throughout American music history. First being the Civil Rights Movement, second being the Anti-Vietnam War Movement, and the third one being the environmental movement. Now, each one of these songs relates to a movement. Blowin' in the Wind actually relates to two. So, Civil Rights Movement is going to go with Joan Baez's We Shall Overcome. The Anti-Vietnam War Movement is going to go with Blowing in the Wind. And the environmental movement is going to go with Big Yellow Taxi. The version we're actually going to look at is not by Counting Crows. We're going to look at the original by Joni Mitchell. All right, so let's dive into these movements. I've got a video on each movement and how music relates, but let's just make sure we're all on the same page. First off, the Civil Rights Movement. This is the one you probably know the most about. I'm going to show you guys a timeline. So essentially, for those of you, quick refresher, the Civil Rights Movement went from 1954 to 1968 formally, and it started with the official kickoff being the case of Brown versus Board. Brown versus Board saying that segregation of schools is not constitutional because separate and equal is not a thing. We progressed all the way through to the Emmett Till murders, Montgomery bus boycott, Little Rock desegregation, all the way pretty much up until the assassination of Martin Luther King. Now, there were a lot of victories in this. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. I want to say, please excuse all of these texts that are popping up. One thing I really want to hit on super quick is the Emmett Till murder, just because a lot of people don't know about this per se. Emmett Till was a black teenager who was killed, like dragged through the streets and drowned. He was 11, I apologize. Was an 11-year-old kid who was dragged through the streets and brutally murdered for apparently whistling at a white woman. Fun fact, within the past few years, the woman who allegedly was whistled at came out and said she made the whole thing up. So they killed this 11-year-old boy for nothing. Crazy. I want to talk about the music of the Civil Rights Movement, and then the music clip we're going to watch and analyze has to do with the March on Washington. I heard your DC trip just got canceled. I'm really sorry, you guys. That sucks. Hopefully you do have a chance to go to DC, and hopefully when you do, you'll be able to go to the Lincoln Memorial. They have a plaque in which MLK did his I Have a Dream speech on the March on Washington. Essentially, the March on Washington was a national protest in which African Americans fought for their rights. So, let's focus on the music of the Civil Rights Movement, what it all meant to each other. In case you didn't know, music plays a huge role in the Civil Rights Movement. As we're going to see in the video, a lot of the Civil Rights Movement had to do with marching. A lot of protest walks, and honestly, I can't even go walking or running without music, and these people couldn't either. So what did they do to pass the time? They sang, and they used these as motivation, kind of like spirituals, an escape, a sense of hope. Here's the video.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome.
Before looking into songs that were part of the Civil Rights Movement, it is first of all important to understand what it was. So first, let's define it. The Civil Rights Movement was a movement to ensure that African Americans have equal access to basic privileges and the rights that every U.S. citizen has. In 1868, the 14th Amendment allowed black people equal protection under the law, and in 1890, they allowed them to vote. Many white people were unhappy with these changes as they saw that people who were once their slaves were now legally equal to them. In an effort to marginalize and separate black people, Jim Crow laws were implemented in the South. This means that black people could only go to certain schools, they could not use the same public facilities as white people, marriage between the two races was illegal, black people were not able to vote since they could not pass voter literacy tests due to lack of education, and it would be challenging for them to get jobs or buy a house. So now let's take a look at what happened with the civil rights movement in the 1950s. So first, let's look at Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was an African-American woman who refused to give up her seat to a white man on the bus and was arrested. Her arrest brought outrage and support, and she was put as one of the faces of the civil rights movement. As a result of her actions, the Montgomery Improvement Association boycotted the Montgomery bus system and was able to get the Supreme Court to declare segregated seating unlawful. In 1954, the Supreme Court made segregation in schools illegal, and the Little Rock Nine, which was a group of black students, volunteered to go into a white school, encouraging more colored students to do the same.
Now, what I probably should have said before we started is that if you look at your notes, I'm asking you for each movement. For each song, talk about the movement associated with it, and 4 bullet points on the movement. Our first song, We Shall Overcome by Joan Baez, is about the civil rights movement. So as you're watching this video, take down 4 bullet points about the civil rights movement's history. All right, continuing on.
And now let's look at the civil rights movement in the 1960s. So the first big event that happened was Woolworth's lunch counter in 1960. This is when 4 black college students wouldn't leave Woolworth's lunch counter until they were served. Soon after, hundreds of people started doing the same and boycotted the restaurants where black people wouldn't be served. Eventually, they got what they desired. This is when students got involved in the civil rights movement. A second large movement was the March on Washington, which happened in 1963. This is one of the most well-known events of the civil rights movement. This is where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous speech, I Have a Dream, in which he discussed his goal of having equality between African Americans and white people. In the event, 200,000 people, black and white, marched peacefully in Washington, wanting a civil rights legislation as well as job equality. In 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, which was started by John F. Kennedy, that allowed for equal employment as well as controlling the use of voter literacy tests. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act was signed, which means there were no more voter literacy tests that prevented almost every African American to vote. Lastly, in 1968, we have the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., and days after his death, the Fair Housing Act was signed, which stopped housing discrimination based on race, sex, religion, and national origin.
Music played a big part in the civil rights movement. Civil rights groups relied heavily on music, so much that Martin Luther King Jr. said music was the soul of the movement. In fact, during long protests, individuals in both courtyards or jail cells would rely on singing and humming to keep unity and energy amongst the crowd. Singing was also an important part of opening and closing ceremonies, as vocal unity helped relieve anxiety and nerves amongst a diverse crowd.
During the civil rights movement, Odetta was a prominent musical figure. She was most known for her song "Oh Freedom," which is sang in March 1963 in Washington, where African Americans fought for their civil and economical rights. The message conveyed through this song is that African Americans will not stand to be treated unequally. As clearly stated within the lyrics of the song, it would rather be worth dying than be spent the rest of their lives in slavery. Thus, the African Americans are standing up and fighting for their freedom, refusing to let slavery continue. Every stanza ends with the same line, and before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free, stating they are free in heaven unlike in real society. The reason why the song is very repetitive is so that everyone can learn the lyrics faster and join in to sing along while protesting.
That's going to be extremely important. You're going to notice with We Shall Overcome especially that it is super repetitive. And that's so it's easy to learn and that people can easily join in. Also so that they can change the lyrics to fit the situation. That's going to be very big with We Shall Overcome.
The tone in the song "Oh Freedom" displays confidence as well as a strong attitude towards their beliefs, which are consistently supported all through the song. Also, throughout the whole song, the singers are confident in their freedom, hoping that they are not going to have to deal with worrying about injustice anymore.
This is also huge. A lot of the civil rights movement is very confident and a lot of strong, and they know who they are. This is going to be a trend that continues.
The background singers sound very powerful and makes one think how it wasn't just one person signing up for this. It was a community, a group, and one giant family.
The tempo of the song starts at 88 beats per minute and ends at 108 beats per minute, which means that the tempo gradually gets faster, symbolizing people gaining more motivation and power and singing more passionately. The song is andante, so that people can walk to the tempo of the song while protesting. Each stanza uses the typical call and response format, one single line of text answered by a repetition of the chorus in each verse. This song has a major key, as the chords sound brighter and cheerful.
The song captures the aspirations and
This video is also doing a really great job of showing you what I'm looking for in that genre breakdown. You'll also be doing a lot of this in a project upcoming.
frustrations of African Americans during this period. Even though Sam Cooke admits that he's living in a world in which he's being discriminated, he has hope that soon living conditions will change and life will become easier. As this song was written during the civil rights movement, when change regarding racism was finally starting to happen, Cooke is giving hope to his audience, motivating them to have a more positive mindset. In this song, there is a lot of instrumentals compared to the other song being a cappella. This song would be played more in gatherings, while the previous song was sung while walking in the streets. This song was written to motivate the African Americans and give them hope for a brighter and better future.
Sam Cooke used a combination of instruments in order to convey different emotions throughout the song. For instance, he used the violin to create a feeling of sadness, but the overall tone of the song is generally very hopeful.
This song is in the key of B flat major. The song is
Please note they spelled rhythm wrong.
2 minutes long and has a tempo of 170 beats per minute, which remains constant throughout the whole song. The genre of this song is rhythm and blues, which is a form of popular music of black origin which began in the 1940s. This genre of music has additions driving rhythms taken from jazz, which is present in this song.
The reason why Sam Cooke chose to write a jazz song is because all black people can connect with this genre of the song. Since they were the ones who invented jazz, the song could connect to them and show their power and personality through their passions and traditions.
There were many other prominent musical figures during the civil rights movement, such as Pete Seeger, Nina Simone, and Charles Albert Tindley. Charles Albert Tindley wrote one of the most popular songs of the civil rights movement called We Shall Overcome. It was played in many of Martin Luther King Jr.'s speeches as it brought a lot of emotion and encouragement.
That's the one we're gonna analyze.
Music played a very important part in the civil rights movement. Civil rights activists were very courageous as they stood up for what they believed publicly and led many African Americans while at the same time receiving multiple threats and facing a lot of discrimination. Music is something that gave them more power. They played it at rallies, marches, and protests to boost people's morale and unify them, giving everyone a sense of power and courage. According to Obama, the civil rights movement was a movement sustained by music, and while the music was inspired by the movement, it also gave strength in return. Thus, we can say that music was a huge factor that allowed for the civil rights movement to happen, and as a result, America has now had an African American president. Even though racism still takes place today, compared to how conditions were before, when African Americans were discriminated, even by the law, we can say that we as a society have made a lot of progress, something which could not have happened without the civil rights movement that was largely based on music. Thank you.
It's been a long.
So guys, I know they talked fast, but the way they analyzed music, that's what I'm looking for. All right, let's look at We Shall Overcome. So the rendition we're going to see is by a woman named Joan Baez. And in this rendition, she is performing at the March on Washington. Again, that giant protest that takes place at the Lincoln Memorial. All right, let's analyze it, shall we?
We are not afraid. We are not afraid. We are not afraid today. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe.
So, I don't know if you guys caught it, but you hear Joan, when she's switching verses, talk about what is coming up. Now, this was a really helpful tool for a lot of people because they could change on the fly based on what was actually happening. So let's analyze, shall we? All right. Now, with protest music, it's going to be very similar to folk. You're going to see a lot of just one melody and then usually string accompaniment. So we have Joan Baez's voice. She's very sweet in her timbre instrument. We got a guitar. We have a lot of people chiming in, so it's not just her, but there's definitely a crowd. We hear the changing of verses to fit the situation. We hear how repetitive it is, so it's easy to learn. What's the musical message? Regardless of this crummy situation that we're in, it will get better and we will overcome. All right, let's talk about movement number 2, shall we? The Vietnam War. Now, Vietnam is always a really interesting war to study because there's a general consensus, especially among the older population, of why do we even get involved. Let's talk about it, shall we?
The Vietnam protest movement was a movement against U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. In 1964, when the movement began, there were 3 groups who had 3 different stances on the war. There was the National Liberation Front, which fought the United States and South Vietnamese government in South Vietnam, liberals, who encouraged the establishment of a democratic government and thus supported the war, and pacifists, who were the core of the Vietnam protest movement. Beginning in December of 1964 with a 25,000-person march on Washington, D.C., the movement only grew larger as the war waged on. The International War Crimes Tribunal was an organization that exposed the United States military's use of illegal chemical weapons such as Agent Orange and napalm, and found that the military was torturing both enemy soldiers and innocent civilians. When these atrocities were revealed to the public, the United States military was compared to the Nazi regime in World War II. From here, protests only became more extreme. In November of 1965, Norman Morrison burned himself to death in protest, prompting 2 more people to do the same. The U.S. military instituted a draft that forced people to fight in the war regardless of whether or not they supported it. In protest, David Miller publicly burned his own draft card and was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. Other people followed Miller's example and burned their draft cards as well. In 1968, students of Columbia University in New York occupied the university's administrative office until police forced them off the campus. Later, these students also targeted a chemical weapons manufacturing facility as a protesting site. Problems were especially evident in the military, with drug abuse, combat refusals, and racial issues prominent throughout squads of soldiers.
So, drug use is obviously not acceptable, nor should you be doing it. 1, because drugs are illegal. 2, because you are not of age, even if it does become legal here soon, which, who knows. But people used it as a way to cope, not a good way to cope. But that's just how much they really hated being there, is they thought it was unfair to be there. Now, what this video didn't talk about is why we were in Vietnam. Essentially, there was a economic system called, and there still is, called communism, and the United States was afraid of it spreading because, in a nutshell, it's the exact opposite of capitalism, or what we have. Capitalism is essentially free market. You can buy whatever you want, do whatever you want. Communism is the government owns everything and kind of disperses out as they see fit. It's a good idea in theory, not great in practice. So the United States wanted to prevent the spread of communism, hence we went to war with them.
Between the years of 1960 and 1973, 503,926 soldiers deserted their military posts in Vietnam. Some soldiers went so far as killing their commanding officers. Veterans threw away the medals they had been awarded for their service in the war and apologized for tearing Vietnam apart. The Vietnam Veterans Against the War organization was formed to protest the war and its atrocities committed toward the Vietnamese people, and continues to promote peace and the well-being of wartime veterans. When the declination and support for the Vietnam War became mainstream, musicians began to get involved. Using dark humor, tongue-in-cheek lyrics, and outright satire, songs were produced about the government's twisted tactics in the Vietnam War and spread word about the government's lies to its citizens. Two of roughly 100 songs that came out of these protests were I Feel Like I'm Fixin' to Die Rag by Country Joe McDonald of Country Joe and the Fish in 1965 and Alice's Restaurant by Arlo Guthrie in 1967.
So we're not going to look at either of those, but this gives you a nice little input about the Vietnam War and the anti-Vietnam War movement. Here's the deal. Is at the same time that civil rights movement was having these huge marches and assemblies, the anti-Vietnam War movement was the same. Actually, a lot of people who supported civil rights were also anti-Vietnam War. And this was one of the biggest songs from that era. It also has some links to the civil rights movement as well. The lyrics will be going across at the bottom. So this is by Peter, Paul, and Mary. As you see, it's 3 people. We got 2 guitars. So there's our instrumentation. Vocal timbre, I want you to look out for harmonies. Lyrics are going to be super interesting on this one, and we'll chat about them in a sec.
How many roads must a man walk down before they call him a man? How many seas must a white dove sail before she sleeps in the sand? How many times must the cannonballs fly before they're forever banned? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. How many years can a mountain exist before it is washed to the sea? How many years can some people exist before they're allowed to be free? How many times can a man turn his head and pretend that he just doesn't see? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. How many times must a man look up before he can see the sky? How many years must one man have before he can hear people cry? How many deaths will it take till he knows that too many people have died? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind.
So they talk a lot in poetry and a lot in how long, what if, all of that, those measures. How long will it take till people realize that people are people? How long will it take till we know that too many people have died? Now, what does blowing in the wind mean? It's up to you guys to figure that out for the message. All right, last movement, team. Doot. Let's talk about the environmental movement. This is going to be Big Yellow Taxi with Joni Mitchell. Here's a little video on what the environmental movement was and why we needed it.
The big bad ocean is going to rise up and swallow half of Florida.
Good.
takes care of our country's Florida problem.
Hello. Today, my short speech with pictures will be focusing on the history of the environmental movement. As seen in the images before you, up until the 1960s, there were very little protections put in place to preserve the environment. In fact, the major populace had no understanding of the harm they were inflicting on the environment. To fully understand the scope of this environmental movement, we must ask ourselves to begin, what did the movement seek to accomplish? The initial goal of the movement was to educate. Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring was the turning point. Selling millions of copies nationwide, Carson's critical analysis of the overuse of pesticides opened the eyes to many citizens of the harm of pesticides on both local ecosystems and their own health. This leads us to the question, what were some of the important actions environmentalists took to further their goal?
So really quick, a pesticide is essentially a chemical that is sprayed on crops in order to stop animals from eating it. One of the most popularly used pesticides during this time was called DDT, and that will be referred to directly in the song.
Rachel Carson's publishing of Silent Spring in 1962 was essentially the catalyst of the modern movement. Carson found that between 1950 and 1962, the amount of DDT, a pesticide, found in human tissue nearly tripled. This brought so much media attention to the cause that President John F. Kennedy read and acted upon the accurate information within the book. From widespread education of the topic sprang the new goal to save the environment. 1 year after the publishing of Silent Spring, the major legislation, the Clean Air Act, passes, which allocates $95 million for the study and cleanup of air and water pollution. From this act emerged regulations, which were placed upon major companies and factories in an effort to minimize emissions. Next, in 1965, the Water Quality Act passes, which allows the government control over water quality. In 1966, the first legislation in regards to endangered species passes. This allowed the Secretary of the Interior to create a list of endangered wildlife and $15 million to protect them. First brought to light in Silent Spring, the American eagle was nearly extinct in the early 1960s. Although they remain on the endangered list today, environmentalists throughout the years have fought and succeeded in preventing the extinction of the American symbol. Finally, one of the major actions during the 1970s was the first National Earth Day. Co-chaired by Congressman Pete McCloskey and coordinated by Dennis Hayes, nationwide an estimated 20 million civilians protested against environmental ignorance. Although in my research, it came across many old grumpy newscasters from both Republican and Democratic news sources preaching that the demonstration was ineffective and the majority of participants were radical youths. Earth Day continues to be a celebrated national holiday, and, according to the American Experience, the first Earth Day remains the largest demonstration ever in American history. As evidenced by the massive crowd during the first Earth Day, there was a major shift in the populace's attitude towards environmentalism. During the 1970s, two major opinions on environmentalism grew. There were those who sympathized with Silent Spring and were concerned over the public health and livelihood of local ecosystems. On the other hand, major companies became politically active against these regulations. As cleaner coal and oil cost more money, the companies were heavily opposed to the Clean Air Act. In fact, the pesticide industry tried to demonize Rachel Carson to dispute Silent Spring, but as botanist Paul Ehrlich stated, Rachel Carson didn't demonize easily. While the movement brought forth several social changes, there were multiple economic gains as well. Due to the emphasis on low emissions, innovators were given a new medium for which to creatively build new low-energy creations. Although the exponential increase in profits seen by fuel-efficient car markets was due to several factors, the environmental movement was one of the major reasons. Before the environmental movement, Americans still drove gas guzzlers, which emitted large amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere. With more and more importance placed on fuel efficiency, cars such as the Tesla, which run on electricity only, are a reality today. Finally, there are still long-term impacts of the environmental movement that continue to affect lives to this day. The red, the white, the blue, the owls? No. But without the Endangered Species Act of 1973, signed by President Richard M. Nixon, American eagles would no longer be soaring high as the symbol of America. Instead, we would be looking for a new mascot. More importantly, in November of 1966, smog covered New York City. Between the 24th and the 30th, there was an increase of 24 smog-related deaths per day. Without the help from the environmental movement, public health would be dire today. Furthermore, without Rachel Carson, Earth Day, and the efforts of many environmentalists, our present environmental situation would be far more dreadful.
Care about climate change?
I don't have to care either.
Me neither. You know why I don't have to care? Because I'll be dead, silly.
Because I'll be dead.
No, you still need to care. Today, the environmental movement has shifted its goals from education to more preventative measures against climate change. Climate change occurs when greenhouse gases blanket the Earth and trap energy in our atmosphere. The greenhouse effect, which is natural, is increasing at an unnatural rate due to the 30 billion tons of CO2 emissions from human activities. Furthermore, after devastating oil spills plagued local ecosystems and killed thousands of animals, environmentalists have begun to take action. For example, in Seattle, Washington, a dozen of kayaktivists were arrested after paddling up to a Shell drilling rig and prevented its departure from the port of Seattle. These environmentalists warn that Arctic drilling will threaten wildlife and worsen climate change. Although environmentalism is widely supported by the major populace today, we must continue to fight for those who cannot speak for themselves and ensure that our environment will remain habitable for future generations.
So that's creepy. There's a little bit about the environmental movement. Now, the song we're going to look at focuses on its birth, really getting big, and this is Joni Mitchell's Big Yellow Taxi. Again, one soloist and a guitar, just like our folk music.
They paved paradise, put up a parking lot with a pink hotel, a boutique, and a swinging hot spot. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? They paved paradise, put up a parking lot. They took all the trees, put them in a tree museum, and they charged the people $1.50 just to see them. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? They paved paradise, put up a parking lot. Hey, farmer, farmer, put away the DDT now. Give me spots on my apples, or leave me the birds and the bees. Please don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? They paved paradise, put up a parking lot. Late last night, I heard the screen door slam, and a big yellow taxi took away my old man. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? They paved paradise, put up a parking lot. I said, don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? They paved paradise, put up a parking lot. They paved paradise, put up a parking lot. They paved paradise, put up a parking lot.
So what did we hear? They talked about tree museums where you pay $1.50 to see them. Hey, anyone ever been to the field? Because it costs like $30 to get in there if you want the premium. And what do you look at? Taxidermy and a bunch of trees. They talked about DDT. They talked about the environment and how cars mess with it. Things to keep in mind for that musical message and analysis. All right, guys, that's it for today. As always, stay safe, wash your hands. Hopefully I'll see you soon. Bye, guys.